All right, here we are for Part C, the final part of Chapter 6 on blood. All right, so let's talk about why on earth we want to know all of these things about blood. Well, you're like, hey, Rachel, that's great that there's red blood cells and these things called erythrocytes, and there's this erythropoietin, and there's all these fancy names, and sure, there's some diseases, but why on earth do I care? And why we care is that we can totally save lives by donating blood, but only if we do it correctly. So donating blood is a super safe procedure, certainly in the United States, with any of the blood donating organizations. If you were somewhere else in the world, you might want to be a little more hesitant depending on the facilities, but for the most part, here in the US, it's super safe. It's very sterile. And here in the US, when you donate blood, you will donate about a pint. And that's the amount that, through research, we've learned that people can donate that amount and still function, for the most part, just fine. I mean, I wouldn't run a marathon after donating, but you can you can function, walk and go to work and still do your daily activities. Your body will be capable of replacing the plasma of your blood within a few hours. So you do want to stay hydrated after you donate. Probably avoid some caffeine because that's going to be a diuretic and actually pull that out. But you're going to replace the plasma in a few hours, and the cells, all those cells that were taken out, you'll replace within the course of a few weeks. So after donating, you've obviously lost a fair bit of blood, I mean, in a safe manner. It's not like it's extending into the body, but a few people feel dizzy afterwards, so there's a whole process where you sit down and you wait. They give you a snack to increase your blood sugar, drink some water, just take your time. So if you do donate blood in the future, if you haven't done it before, do give yourself plenty of time to get home afterwards, or just take a break. Don't plan a meeting typically for right after donating. For me, I always make sure it's the last thing that I'm going to do in a day, and I don't have anything going on that evening. Once you donate, your blood will be tested at least for syphilis, for HIV, and hepatitis. They often do many other tests. If any of them come back positive, they won't be able to use your blood, but they will absolutely notify you. If they are aware that you have a disease, they're going to make sure that you also know that, so that you can take the appropriate action to try to get healthy. And then the benefit is that your blood at that point can save many lives. So donated whole blood will often, once it's tested and deemed appropriate, it will be stored in a refrigerated facility until it's needed. I believe there is a way of freezing it, but it'll be stored so that nothing is damaged. And then sometimes one person might use an entire pint of donated blood one time. Sometimes someone, particularly in the ER, who's lost a lot of blood, might receive multiple donations of whole blood all at once because they've lost so much. Other times, I know I donated once and I was able to find out that that blood was actually divided between 3 people. And so that was kind of cool. So your blood can help save a lot of different lives. But donating blood only works when we actually match the blood types appropriately. And to do that, we need to understand ABO, blood typing terminology. And these, it can get confusing, and so I just encourage you to take your time on this topic. Just sit down, work it out, commit this to memory, and once you've got it down, you can solve absolutely any blood typing question that myself or anyone else throws at you. So it's mostly just because both the words start with anti. So antigens and antibodies. Antigens are markers on the outside of your cells. One of the discussion videos has a really nice illustration of this. So antigens are markers on the outside of your cells, and what we care about is that it's on the outside of red blood cells. Antigens can also be on the outside of foreign cells as well. So antigens are going to show up again when we talk about the immune system. And antibodies are also part of the immune system. So really what we are seeing here is our body trying to protect us from external blood that's not our own. It's just that sometimes we can, depending on your blood type, we can fudge it a little bit and be okay. So that's what we're looking at. So antigens are little markers on the outsides of your cells. You can literally think of them as a name tag. Antibodies are significantly smaller because they're just a protein. And they're a little protein that binds to a specific antigen. But antibodies, for the most part, are just free-floating, moving around the blood. So the reason you have antibodies is that your body made them in order to fight foreign antigens. They can pair up to those foreign antigens. That allows them to identify something as foreign and therefore destroy it later. And if we added blood to your body that was foreign, that could lead to this clumping, and that would be really harmful. That would create a blood clot where we don't want one. So it's meant to protect you, but in the case of a blood transfusion, there's potential for damage. And in that blood transfusion, we're literally transferring blood from one individual to another individual. In the U.S. Civil War, you know, they figured out how to do blood transfusions, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, because we didn't understand, we didn't have the technology to understand this ABO blood typing at the time. So it was a very risky procedure. Now that we understand this, we can absolutely take it into consideration and avoid any unnecessary deaths from a mismatched blood type. So we know we have antigens, we know we have antibodies. Blood type, so you know, I have A positive blood. My blood type, A positive, is determined by which antigens are on my red blood cells. So because I am A, I have A antigens on my red blood cells. That means I do not have B antigens on my red blood cells. Instead, I have anti-B antibodies, which, if it helps you, just say B antibodies. Okay, so that's what I have. So whichever antigens you do have, you will not have that same antibody. If you did, they would clump up and you'd have blood clots all the time, and we don't want that. So whichever antigen you do have, which is your blood type, you will have the opposite antibodies. So as we look at our picture on the right, we see type A blood has type A antigens and B antibodies. Type B blood has B antigens and A antibodies. Type AB blood has both A and B antigens. And so that means they actually have no antibodies. They just don't have any. And type O blood is not a third antigen called O, but rather it's just a lack of type A and a lack of type B antigens. So, without any antigens, that means that type O blood does have A antibodies and B antibodies. The biggest mistake I see people making is either getting the A's and the B's mixed up and thinking that O is actually a third type when it's actually just the lack of A and B. Okay, so those are how you do the A, B, and the O. RH is another antigen. Sometimes it's called D. But basically, this is where the positive and negative comes from. So because I have A positive blood, let's just draw my red blood cell. So here's Rachel's red blood cell, and I know I have A positive because I've donated before. So this tells me about my antigens. It tells me that I have an A antigen on my red blood cell. And it also tells me, let's see, I'll draw a square, that I have the D, also known as the RH. I don't care which one you use. You can just stick with RH if you want. I have the RH antigen on my red blood cell. If you have negative blood, let's say somebody out there in our class has A negative blood, boop, you would have the A antigen, we've established that, and then that's it. You don't have the RH antigen. You could have the RH antibody then, but you wouldn't have the antigen. So plus and minus, again, is just whether you do have the RH antigen or you don't have the RH antigen. And you will have the opposite antibody. So, for practice, definitely, whether you do it right now or later, doesn't matter, but grab this chart, work your way down, and try to fill it out without looking ahead. Okay, which antigens do we have? We can do the first row together. So blood type is A negative. We said the antigens that are on the red blood cells are reflected by the blood type. So if it's A negative, they must have A antigens. But that's it, right? Because the negative means there's not an RH. So the antibodies would be B and RH. Those are the types of antibodies they'd have. So if we count, we have 1, 2, 3. Somewhere in that row, we had those 3 things written. And every time you fill in one of these rows, the number 3 should be at the end of the row. You should have no duplicates. Somewhere in that line you'll have an A, somewhere you'll have a B, and somewhere you'll have an RH. But you'll never have any of those things twice within the same blood type. So go ahead, pause now, fill this all out, make sure you're solid, check with the next page. So here are the answers. Feel free to check your work. If anything at this point doesn't make sense, go back, listen again, see if you can figure it out. If not, email me right away so that we can nail this down. Because if this doesn't make sense, the rest of it's going to be pretty tough later on doing the transfusion problem solving. All right, so that's where we're headed next, is how can you determine if blood types are compatible for a blood transfusion? So first of all, A positive can give and receive A positive, and A negative can be A negative, AB positive to AB positive. If you have an exact match, that's always going to work. No problem. We don't even have to do a problem solving question, right? But if, let's say, someone had A positive and A negative, that answer is going to be different potentially depending on which one's the donor and which one's the recipient. So we do have to do a little problem solving to find the answer. So what's going on here? Here are the 3 steps to solve these questions, and you can memorize these 3 steps, always do these 3 steps, and you will consistently get the right answer. So number 1, identify, ID, the antigens on the donor's red blood cells. 2, identify the antibodies in the recipient's blood. Step 3, if in the answer to number 1 and the answer to number 2, if you have any duplicates, if you have an A and an A, if you have a B and a B, or an RH and an RH, any of them are the same, that would form a blood clot, and that would not work. Okay? Consistently, you can do those 3 things and you will always solve these problems correctly, which is why filling in that chart correctly will allow you to do this part correctly. So, if the antibodies in the recipient's blood recognize the antigens on the donor's red blood cells, then the blood will agglutinate or clump and cause rejection or cause a clot, and that's what we do not want. Some of you may be wondering why the opposite isn't true. Why do the antibodies of the donor and the antigens of the recipient not clump? And that's essentially that when blood is donated, it is cleaned a little bit, and in that process, the donor's antibodies, remember they're super, super, super tiny, they're just little proteins. The donor's antibodies are essentially cleared from the blood. So there aren't even any to cause a reaction. So donors are donating blood, but really they're just donating red blood cells and some cleaned out plasma. And so that's why we don't have to worry about the opposite combination. It's also a nice way to remember that it's the donor's red blood cells we care about, because the donator is donating only red blood cells, essentially. So for any blood donation questions, basically just have a family member pick between one of the 8. Pick one as a donator, one as a donor, one as a recipient, and solve them repeatedly and make sure that you did it right each time. And if you did, after 6 or 7 of them, you're good to go. This next part is just wrapping up here, looking at the Rh factor. Why do we even care about that Rh factor? And it has to do, we mentioned this earlier, the hemolytic disease of the newborn. That's what we're describing here. So this will only happen if these things are all true. If the mom is Rh negative and the fetus is Rh positive, and this is the mom's second pregnancy with that situation. So just for your own sake right now, mom's negative, fetus is positive, and it's the second positive baby that this mom has had. Okay, so we're going to walk through what's going on. In the first pregnancy, we've got a positive baby, but the placenta is moving nutrients to and from the baby, but it's not able to actually take the baby's blood and transfer it into mom's blood. They're separated, and things will cross between the two. And only little things will cross between the two. So an antigen attached to a cell is just too big. So during the first birth, which is a relatively bloody process, some of the Rh positive blood from the fetus is transferred to the mother during birth, not during the pregnancy, but during delivery. And when that Rh positive blood with its red blood cells with an Rh antigen get into the mom's blood, that stimulates the mom's blood to make Rh antibodies. Previously, the mom didn't have Rh antibodies. So actually, if your blood is a negative blood type and you have never been exposed to positive blood, either because you're a person who's never given birth, or you've never received a transfusion, or you've never exchanged blood with somebody, which is usually, always a good rule of thumb, you don't actually have Rh antibodies. We kind of gloss over that earlier, but technically that's the case. So in this particular instance, when mom and baby's blood has now crossed, mom makes Rh antibodies for the first time. But the baby's already born, it's already out of her body, so there's nothing that her antibodies can do to that baby's blood. This is why it only affects the second fetus. So if mom becomes pregnant with a second fetus that is Rh positive, which again is possible with the mixing of genes from mom and dad, then the mom's antibodies, remember they're really tiny, they can actually leak across the placenta, and then because they're positive, they can bind the positive antigens in the baby's blood, and what we say is attack the fetus. So it causes the fetus's blood to clump, and obviously that's very dangerous. So we don't obviously want this to happen, and now that we understand how it happens, we can actually take steps to prevent it from even being a potential problem. at least with modern medicine. So what we do now is when an Rh negative woman is about or is pregnant, when she's about to give birth, she is given an injection, I believe following the delivery, of anti-Rh antibodies. We actually just give her the antibodies because her body will then be like, oh, well, I have the antibodies. They're binding to the antigens. It's all taken care of. Her body doesn't really realize that it should make the antibodies because we already artificially added them to, quote unquote, do that job of cleaning up the fetus's red blood cells. So we've got to do this within 72 hours of giving birth to the first baby. Mom will never make her own antibodies. Therefore, in the second pregnancy, there simply are no antibodies to bind to the fetus's blood. So we basically just prevent the whole thing. Keep in mind, please, that in other parts of the world where women do not have access to health care and do not have access to reproductive care, this absolutely still kills babies. It puts mom in jeopardy, of course, a little bit too then. So we know how to prevent it, but having complete access is still not universal. Here's an image for how this works in case that's going to help you. When we have the fetus's blood on the left, fetal Rh positive blood cells leak across the placenta into the mother's red bloodstream. So this is during that delivery. We see one of these red blood cells head over here, and that's going to stimulate the production of these Rh antibodies. And then in the second pregnancy, those antibodies can leak across in this direction across the placenta and bind to these red blood cells and cause big clumps. So that's the order in which the hemolytic disease of the newborn takes place.